Muslims, the issue of can rationality establish the belief in a creator. Obviously, I think the brothers have already mentioned it. We believe that, and there are different schools within the Islamic, position on this particular question. So all of the schools, they believe in this idea of fitra, this innate disposition within a human being that assents or that accepts the idea that a belief that God exists, that there's this creator that exists. And then there are people who have various arguments, from the Islamic theological schools, which tries to rationalize and justify that. And that even includes people like Ibn Taymiyyah, Imam Ghazali, Imam Juwayni, and many others within that tradition. So, there is a general acceptance that you can establish the belief that there is in existence a creator who had agency, but the actual nature of this being, in terms of being able to experience this being as the being experiences himself, then that obviously is beyond our rational capacity. That's why, and I think when I left, actually, which is a while ago now, but when I left that discussion about epistemology, what's the epistemic basis of Islam? Well, the general epistemic basis of Islam is the fact that we believe that we have the ability to make rational conclusions. We have the ability to make have rational thought. In Arabic, we use the word dalil aqli, evidence of the mind, and then obviously we say that the mind has limitations, so it can't understand everything, which is different to maybe some of the philosophers of the past who believe that, well, you can rationalize everything. So there are going to be epistemic limits, and that's why we have something called dalil naqli, which is textual evidence or revelatory evidence as well. So therefore, what we say as Muslims is that we can, whether it's observing the universe in a very simple way or going into more sophisticated arguments, come or acknowledge the existence of a creator. But in terms of what the creator wants from us, how the creator exists, what's the specific ontology of the creator, how the creator knows things, then those things we can't know directly. And when we talk about the attributes of God, we generally talk about them in a analogical predication, which basically means that they are similar but not identical to what we experience. I don't know if that helps, Mukunda.
Well, so this is what I was trying to say. So that's what I was trying to get at for a while, is that's what I wanted to hear from someone, right? So that comports very, very clearly with a lot of what our tradition is. Like Vishishtadvaita has the three methods of knowing: pratyaksha, anumana, shabda, right? Pratyaksha is sense perception, anumana is inference, although our inference is induction, not deduction. And then finally we have shabda pramana, which is scripture, as we can say, right? They each have purview. And this is the point that I was trying to drive, is that commonality, right? How do we approach our textual our understanding of the world? How do we get to the place about knowing God, what God wants, or knowing how do we even know the world? How do we trust our sense of sight and smell, and in this world too? So I agree with you there. So I think we have commonality here on how we approach the text.
And I can see that commonality. Imam Ghazali, he mentions in his book Al-Mustasfa, which was his book on principles of jurisprudence, and he talks about that there are three ways of knowing, and very similar to what you said, actually. One, which is through experience. Secondly, he talks about things like inference or deductive logic, or even inductive logic to a certain extent as well, but basically inference. And the third way was through testimonial evidence, and he gives various evidences and arguments in order to justify all three things. I think the issue would then be is that, okay, what are the particular logical or scriptural arguments to justify one particular set of beliefs over another set of beliefs? Because as Muslims, we believe in this idea of an exclusive truth, that we believe Islam is exclusively true,
right?
Which I don't know if you hold the same position in regards to Hinduism.
I think our position is inclusive truth across the board, but at gradations.
Okay, what do you mean by gradations? Sorry.
What I mean is all experience of divinity is real, and you're actually experiencing God or whatever, but you might not have a more full experience. Ultimately, because we can't fully experience God anyway, given our limitations as human beings, because God is infinite, we are not. You can't experience infinity in fullness. So there is something from not experiencing God to totally experiencing God. There's a spectrum, and we're saying that every single experience of God is in that spectrum.
Right. Okay. So we would probably say something slightly different in terms of the fact that we believe that when we look at human beings, we say, okay, human beings have certain, instincts. They have certain biological needs. They need to eat, need to drink, need to sleep. They also have certain instinctual drives, like, for example, procreational instinct, survival instinct, the desire to acquire wealth. These are innate within human beings, something that has been, we would use the word like the qadr of a human being, the attribute of a human being. Yeah. And we also talk about this idea of a sanctification instinct or a spiritual instinct as well.
Sure.
So we say that human beings, they have these drives. Some of them are instincts, or we term instincts. Some of them are called biological needs. And then we say that in and of themselves, none of the instincts, the drives, tells us whether it's good or bad, whether we're satisfying it in the right way or the wrong way. So a person could, in an extreme situation, engage in procreational instinct by raping somebody. Yeah. So we wouldn't say that that's, the right way to do it. Yeah.
No,
Or
neither would we. Yeah.
yeah, or somebody might be LGBTQI, and we'd again, from an Islamic basis, from our particular paradigm, we'd say that's incorrect. But it doesn't necessitate that just because they're seeking a satisfaction from the instinct, that how makes it correct or wrong, yeah, or right or wrong, yeah. It just a satisfaction. And in the same way, if we classify the spiritual instinct or the need to sanctify something more than material, something that's divine, then just because somebody's sanctifying doesn't make it good or bad or right or wrong. It has to have further justification. And that's where, as Muslims, we believe that this is where this epistemic limit comes in our ability, that if we have this drive that wants to seek moral values, this drive that wants to worship, then we need some sort of revelatory guidance to tell us how to satisfy these instincts. And so we would never make the basis of the satisfaction to say, okay, it must be true because somebody's satisfying it. Rather, we would say, well, that's just the drive. What makes it true now is whether it's in accordance to what this absolute divine reality wants from us in how to satisfy these things.
Sure. I mean, so similarly, we would say even especially in my tradition, the idea that the Vedas can guide you on dharma, right? What is right, wrong, what is acceptable, as to engagement in the world, right? And that's not something you can reason your way to, or know directly by observing others. It's something that you have, that the texts have to give you. Like, for example, ahimsa a value to follow? Why is nonviolence? When we look around the entire world, the entire nature of the world is violence, right? We have to eat. Animals kill each other. Nature just destroys. Everything is violence. So the end of the day, it's the texts, the Vedas themselves, and the Shastras, or the Shastras, are the ones that give you the values, and you can reason to some of it. There's some ways to see compassion is better than non-compassion. We can see that, right? But the ultimate values are given through the texts.
Yeah, so that's where the distinction would be, because we would say, okay, how would we, for example, from a Muslim perspective, how would we justify our text being correct? How would we?
You mean in opposition to others?
No, not even opposition to others, but just simply say, okay, as a Muslim, we would say, okay, why do we believe Islam and the Quran to be that revelation, to be correct, to be followed? So we would then have to try to justify that particular position. I don't know if that's the same thing within your particular belief system.
Yeah. So this is where, like, for example, you have the conversations with the Buddhists, the Jains, and other traditions outside the Hindu fold. We're called Astikas, which means the ones who believe in the Vedas. They're called Nastikas, the ones who don't. And this is a conversation that we intend to have about the nature of the Vedas, right? Why they accept and why we don't, or why we accept and why they don't, right? So yeah, there is some level of justification built into the why one should accept the Vedas.
have what type of arguments therefore do you sort of utilize in order to justify your own position? Because a lot of these things, like you said, they can't be rationalized in terms of the good and the bad of these certain things. You have to have some sort of revelatory authority. So it's like, how do we justify that? What has been said by such and such person, whether that's 1400 years ago or a few thousand years ago, how do we
Sure.
justify that being correct, being something that should be followed?
Right. So the thing is, first thing is like, things like karma, right? Like there are certain things that are built into the text that we first probably infer through looking around the world, right? The law of cause and effect, we see how that plays out. And that comes into a text, and that's part of it. And the way we justify, so why do we have to be good versus not good is karma, correct? I mean, that's our tradition. It's better to do good actions because otherwise there's karma consequences. Where does karma come from? The text. So the justification, it's a much deeper one. And honestly, I'm not an expert on this tradition called Mimamsa, which does this kind of work. So I can probably read up on it and have a conversation about the justification later on that. I don't recall off the top of my head. So
yeah, okay, no problem. That's fine. But obviously, from our tradition, that's quite essential in terms of being able to have some sort of justification. And obviously, various people have various different types of justifications that they would use in order to say, okay, this is the correct position to hold, and this makes this therefore is true, or and therefore opposes something else, which we'd say is therefore incorrect because it doesn't accord to that. Because, like I said, within the Islamic paradigm and tradition, within the Quran, it's very clear that the only religion acceptable to God is Al-Islam. That's what it says. So we'd have
so we don't have that, right? So our need to say you have to accept this view is not built on that. The idea again comes that that one spiritual journey is for them to practice and follow, and once you get to a certain stage of like so in this work, it goes to things like our sense of like right and wrong being pulled by karma, right? Karma, I mean, this is where the theory gets complex, where you have like prarabdha karma, you have sanchita karma, you have all these different types of karma that change or formulate the person to who they are today, right? You have the push and pulls from your past life, desires that when you are born into this life, those desires get inscribed onto that fetus, and that fetus, it's how we explain that when a fetus is born and becomes a child, you might have natural inclinations, natural skills, natural aversions, and over time, those get reinforced through karma and back and forth. And that's, if your karma was on a good trajectory, you're more likely to follow the path of like trying to free yourself of the world of samsara, which is the cycle.
Yeah. One thing that, and this is maybe it is related to what you just said, but it's a slight sidetrack, but it'll get back to it. Because whenever I've heard the Hindus discuss with Muslims, they sort of tend to think that a lot of Muslims, they always focus on the belief, and for Hindus it's about actually the practical actions and the guidance. I don't know if you get that impression yourself. That Muslims are really
can you explain that? That
Muslims want to talk about like the real, the foundation of reality. What is real? What is reality? What is the metaphysics? What is belief in God? That becomes so essential. And some Hindus, they sort of see that as well. Why are you really that interested in that? I don't know if you get that same impression with regards to Muslims, that they're focused on these because sometimes it's perceived as being abstract or academic.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I do see that because I mean, like earlier in this conversation, we talked about certainty being such an important thing, which is why I guess there's this drive to intellectualize and kind of get there by logic. And I guess in the Hindu context, there's like two major things, which is really, we have the practice itself, which is the ortho practice, of the religion. And then so people don't care as much what you believe, but like what you do. And secondly, I think the other Hindu tradition idea is outside of that is experience. So it's what you do plus experience. It's really the two, I think, focuses that Hindus tend to have.
Yeah, so, but the reason why I mentioned that point, and I was just trying to understand your particular perspective on this issue, is because a lot of the discussions about practical actions, especially the way you were explaining karma and about reincarnation and past life and how that impacts upon the fetus and that sort of creates inclinations within the fetus, etc. See, a lot of that stems from belief, and that's why as Muslim, and I'm not here to argue for or against your particular position. I'm just trying to explain to you from my position and help you understand from like when you discuss with other Muslims, is that a lot of Muslims, what they see is that the importance of belief informs a person about their viewpoint on life, and then that would inform them about things like morality, what's the right thing to do, what's a good life, how society should be, etc. So that's why as Muslims we like to talk about, theological justifications for belief, revelation. How do we know that revelation actually occurred? How do we know that it's preserved? How do we know that this person that claims something, who was he? Is it justified to follow him in what he has said? All of these things are really important for us, not because it's just simply about being exclusive and we are right and everybody else is wrong, but rather it's because as Muslims we have to justify that first and foremost to our own self in order to be able to be justified in order to the actions that we perform, what we see as the good life, what we see as the right thing to do. So that's why belief for us is really important. And just as a final point, that's why in the Quran, when if various people, when you read the various verses within the Quran, you'll see this theme of belief and good actions constantly linked together. Yeah. In fact, it's mentioned 65 times in the Quran, because the idea is that the belief is what grounds the good actions and informs human beings what the good actions are.
Right. I mean, so I think part of this is like, so I from my gathering, as we're talking, it seems part of this is a lot of, Muslims are kind of uncomfortable with uncertainty, with there is either you're certain or you're not. There's the grayness is not something that sits well. And I think this is something within the Hindu framework, especially if in a text like Mahabharata, it sits in a lot of gray, right? Yes, there's what the value or goal of individuals should be, and then how they behave, and then how that tends to play out in terms of everyday human existence, right? Like even the idea of everyone loves to say ahimsa or nonviolence is like the greatest thing from the Indian tradition, in the Hindu tradition, but the fundamental nature of the world is violence, right? And this is the Mahabharata that talks about it. To live, one must eat. People must eat other animals, must eat plants. Life feeds on life. So where does nonviolence come in, right? So these ideas that sit in the text are dealing with the difficulty of human life. And it's to say that the ambiguity that exists there, because karma, and we don't have absolute, right? There's no heaven and hell absolutely. The freedom to figure out our path is presented to us. Like God, so this is where I wanted to go with part of this conversation, is what the theological nature of God, right? Part of this is what I wanted to talk theology. I wanted to talk about what is God, all merciful, all knowing, all powerful? How does that play into the theodicy of human existence? So it just, that's
so,
kind of,
how much more time do you have? How much more time do we have, guys? Brother Sharif Mukunda? Can we go on for maybe another hour or so? Is that
half
okay?
an hour, definitely.
Sure.
Half an hour. Okay. Yeah. So great question. I do want to make sure we sort of get as much of that into the next half an hour as possible. Okay, go ahead.
So what I would say is this, is that as Muslims we sort of have gradations of knowledge. So it's not the case that everything has to be certain. Yeah. In Arabic we use the word qat'i. Yeah. So not everything has to be qat'i. But what it is that, and even the discussion of what does this term yaqeen or certainty actually, what does it mean? Does it represent that you have to have a logical Descartesian proof for every single thing? I don't think any Muslim really believes that. Yeah. It's a case of what's intuitive, what's rational, and what's consistent, and what creates that psychological certainty, within a human being. And therefore, you have to have some sort of rational justification and background in order to create that psychological certainty. That's what, as Muslims, would say. We also believe that there are other types of knowledge as well. There are other types of, epistemic levels within Islam. So, for example, we have this term ijtihad. I don't know if you've come across this, Mukundar. So ijtihad means derivation of Islamic law. So there are certain rulings within Islam which are quite clear, and then there are rulings within Islam which require a form of derivation, istinbat or ijtihad, exertion upon the text. And those derivations are not going to be certain. They're going to be, to the propensity of the scholar that's investigated it, and the person who's investigated the text. And there's a famous scholar of Islam called Imam Shafi'i, and on these areas of ijtihadat, which is these areas that have to be derived, he says, I'm right, but with a possibility of being wrong, and I believe my opponent is wrong, but he has a possibility of being right. Yeah.
Right.
So we do have these gradations within sort of the Islamic epistemic framework or an Islamic paradigm, that you can have these things, and some of these things may be on moral or ruling questions which would be related to morality. But what we would say is that the foundation of these spaces has to have a certain level of certainty, certain level of trust and confidence, such that it would seem to us, anyway, ridiculous to reject these things. So that's how we would see these types of issues. And in terms of the things regards to like the problem of evil, there are different views in terms of the Islamic paradigm. Some views are that what they term skeptical theism. I don't know if you come across that term.
Sure. Yeah.
So
the Christians use it a lot.
Yeah. So the idea, which is that, well, we don't really know. We believe that we have trust and confidence that God is good, all powerful, all merciful, all wise, but ultimately we can never really understand the real intent behind why suffering exists. Other people will argue that evil is a privation, of good, which means it's a lack of good. So it's not the case that God creates evil, but rather it's just a lack of good. And there may be reasons for that in terms of the fact that it's soul building, that it allows human free will. Other people may argue that this idea of suffering being inherently evil isn't of itself inherently evil. It's just an event within the universe. And what makes something good or bad is whether it's in accordance to the legal text of Islam. Yeah. So therefore, an earthquake is neither good or evil, even if it causes devastation. It's just an event. Yeah. So
yeah, but that goes to questions like, ultimately God knows about this event and these people are going to die, and then if these people are haven't accepted God or have rejected God and they haven't had a chance to reject him or accept him again, then how does that affect their eternal life? And those questions play a role.
Yeah. So what we would say in terms of salvation, because and non-salvation, is that we don't take a necessarily position which is that a person who is held accountable for knowledge that he doesn't have, ultimately.
I get that. I know that.
What level of knowledge a person has may be differed over in terms of the different schools of Islamic thought, because some scholars say, well, you as a rational human being should at least come to the conclusion that one God exists. Some scholars say, well, you should at least know some of because it's inbuilt within us, a part of our fitra, innate nature, which is that certain things are wrong to do, like murder, stealing, lying. Other scholars say, well, actually, these things can't be known until revelation, and therefore God will hold them to account. ultimately what we say as Muslims, because these are speculative ways of trying to understand this, and maybe some
Right.
indication within the Islamic text. But ultimately, what we say is that we ultimately are not the ones that are going to make that judgment. We have that trust and confidence that God, being all merciful, all good, will hold people to account. Now, from my position, I believe that God only holds those people to account when a messenger is sent to them, or they hear a message, and the message comes to them in a clear and categorical way, and then they reject it. So
Yeah.
Imam Ghazali also holds a very similar position, which he basically says that majority of human beings are not going to be held accountable in terms of being put in hellfire, because the message didn't come to them in that particular way. So ultimately, though, the main position that all the schools hold is that you're only accountable based upon the knowledge that you have, and if you don't have that knowledge, then you're not going to be held accountable for it.
Right, but like someone like me who's read the Quran and has engaged, but I don't buy into it. I have the knowledge, I just don't accept it.
Oh, you're done for then, Mukunda. You're done for.
I know.
I'm joking. No. Ultimately, we say this. As Muslims, we can't say anybody's definitely in hellfire or definitely in heaven, because we don't have that type of knowledge. Well, I don't know what's in your mind. I don't know your intentions. I don't know your sincerity.
Sure.
So we don't make that conclusion. We can say, yes, if a person generally rejects Islam, then that is disbelief, and that's disbelief in God, and therefore God will hold them to account. And punish them or give them reward according to God's mercy and wrath. That's God's judgment. We don't make that judgment. We can make general judgments, but we can never make specific judgments upon each individuals. What I would say to you, though, is that as Muslims, what we try to do, or certainly as myself, and I'll speak about myself, is what I try to do is I try to take away as many of the biases, many of my cultural baggages as possible when I try to investigate any religion, even including my own religion, and try to understand it and say, okay, if I was a person, who has just found himself on a desert island, with no memory, what conclusions could I come with? Because I think what tends to happen is that knowingly or unknowingly, we tend to use our own biases, our own cultural backgrounds, our own family backgrounds as a way to sort of judge, or becomes a paradigm by which we start to view other religions and other belief systems. And from our perspective, what we try to do is we try to say, okay, let's try and remove that as best possible, remove the human ego element as much as possible when we look at some of these types of questions.
Yeah, I mean, sure, but I mean, at some level, I mean, we are talking about like the nature of God, right? About how the conceptions of God that we have coming from the text and understanding of that, right? Because if you're saying the text is certain about what God is and who God is, then very clearly they're also certain about the qualities of God, right?
What do you mean by the text is certain about who God is and what God is?
Right. We know the God, like for example, we know God isn't the devil, right? It's very clear in the Quran that there's a being called Allah and there's a being called Satan. So we have the identity of God fixed in some sense, right? Along with the qualities that God has within the text, correct?
Yeah, so we say God is an uncreated, independent, eternal being. Yeah. And
Right.
Satan
And then you have other qualities,
being.
whether it's going to be, he's, all merciful. He has 99 names, right? The 99 names, which are
all
his qualities.
Merciful, all good, the subduer, the one who punishes, the one who rewards, etc. Yeah, the one who witnesses.
So all those things, right? And when we're talking, we've been talking with logic and everything a lot. So those, when logic applies to those, do you guys apply the same rigor of logic to the qualities and whether they can adhere in the same being, or is it something?
So philosophers generally now accept that there isn't really a logical problem of the problem of evil. Rather, a lot of atheist philosophers, even atheist philosophers admit this now. What they move towards is more of an evidentialist argument.
I mean, I can grant you that some people do accept there's no logical problem of evil.
Not just some. I think that's generally the position now in modern philosophy, which is that there isn't really an argument to say it's logically impossible for there to be suffering and an all good, all powerful God exists. What they say is, well, what is the evidentialist perspective? What should we expect to see? Which is a different question.
Well, yeah, I'm not. Yeah, I mean, I guess. I mean, I have to think that through a little bit more, but Yeah, okay, I can grant you that. I'll grant you that, Bernie.
So this is the problem. Problem is that with an evidentialist argument, and sometimes evidentialist arguments are good arguments, but sometimes with evidentialist arguments, you have to start with certain assumptions. And
Sure.
like, for example, have you heard the argument about divine hiddenness? It's an atheist argument.
I have, yeah.
Yeah. So that assumes that, God would want everybody to be compelled to belief by an evidence that is impossible to deny. Yeah. So that assumes that, and therefore it also assumes that other arguments are not sufficient in coming to the conclusion that a creator exists, that they're not justified for that. So it assumes what God would want and then say, okay, this is what we should expect. And this is where me and you probably agree, Mukundar, which is that we have this epistemic limit in terms of understanding what God would want, because we're finite, limited creatures, and we're talking about unlimited, infinite being, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or the creator. And so therefore we can't make these types of, these assumptions about God would want to create within the universe. Yes, we can say that there are going to be logical problems if somebody can present a clear logical argument that says it's logically impossible. But I don't think anybody's ever produced a logical argument that has been successful in this particular question or in other questions. That's why, like I said, many of the modern atheists now have agreed that there isn't really a logical problem, but rather it's they more argue from an evidentialist problem.
Yeah, I mean, if you're saying a straight syllogism, yeah, I mean, if that's the definition of the logical problem of evil doesn't exist, sure. But I mean, I think there is something to be said here about if God has X, Y, Z qualities, how can there still be evil is a legitimate question that has not been dealt with.
It's like I said, there's different theodicies that people have presented, but I think what it is that the way I would look at this question is, have I got good reasons to accept God exists? Have I got good reasons that the Quran is the word of God? If I've got good reasons on that perspective, and I've got something which is not a logical impossibility on the other hand, it's not affirming a logical impossibility on the other hand, it's some sort of logical possibility, then I'm now going to weigh, isn't it? I'm going to weigh whether the good reasons that I have to justify my belief is sufficient and warranted such that, I could, say that overrides any evidentialist argument. And I believe that they do. And as I mentioned, there's skeptical theism, which basically skeptical theism for the audience is just simply saying that we don't know why there's suffering and evil within the world. I know you understand. I'm just saying for the audience, because some people think skeptical theism means we're skeptical about whether God. So skeptical. So there's that position. There's various theodicies people have brought up, whether they're successful or not, or whether they counteract the evidentialist argument. That's a separate point. But there's various things that people argue regards to that. But at the same time, we've also got. Sorry, Mohammed, you're on your mic.
Sorry.
So, and on the other hand, you've got a body of arguments that I would follow that justifies the existence of the creator, and I would say, okay, that overrides any of these concerns that people might have.
Yeah, so it seems like what you're saying is the first level is you make a logical position of accepting God or such a being exists, and then secondarily is a textual level as to and why you should accept this text.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
So rational, we'd say rational, maybe more of a broader way than saying logical. So we'd say rational justification for belief in a creator, a rational justification to believe in the authority of the text.
Right.
And then if you've got that, and some of these questions come out, and then we say, okay, can we categorize these questions? Are the propositions that are being brought forward with these, contentions, are they demonstrating a logical impossibility or logical possibility? Or is it a metaphysical impossibility or metaphysical impossibility or metaphysical possibility? If we're saying, okay, ultimately these are within the area of possibility, then I'm now going to affirm the text, which I have rational justifications and reasons to believe in, over any logical possibility, which is different maybe from a point of view where we would criticize Christianity from our perspective, from a Muslim perspective, where we would talk about the logical problem of the Trinity, where we would say this is a proposition that actually results in a logical impossibility.
So let me ask you a hypothetical epistemological question then. So say the Quran said fire is cold. Is that something you would take to be true?
So it depends what we mean here. Are we just talking about from the very clear, apparent meaning that all fire that we experience is cool? Then I think that type of proposition would be sufficient to negate any revelation that claims that.
Okay, so then so that type of proposition would make the Quran not what's it called?
Yeah, all fire. Yeah, so all fire.
But if it just said fire and it's not specific as to all, and it was just like fire, then that's something that you would use interpretation to address, correct?
Well, you would reconcile it within the text. You would say, okay, is it a specification from the general? Yeah. So we know, for example, Ibrahim alayhi salam, Prophet Abraham, he had a fire that God caused to be cool. Yeah. So that we can accept because we're saying that in the context of laws of nature, we don't take laws of nature like, the first law of thermodynamics or second law of thermodynamics as logical necessities. We just take them as nomological necessities, or they are true by experience or true by induction.
Got it. Okay. So, I mean, in that sense, essentially, the laws of nature or physical experience of the world, it takes precedence in the world as long as the Quran is not talking about all, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So if for example, let's take the issue of fire, because obviously we only have to experience one instance of fire being hot. And if somebody's claiming that all instances of fire are cold, then we can say, okay, well, that's falsified by that one instance.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, so does that apply to even history? Like, so for example, if we know something in history we say the evidence today leads one way, but the Quran has a different perspective. Is the Quran generally considered to be more accurate than what we have today? I mean,
so it depends, isn't it? Again, it depends upon the epistemic level of history. So if the historical evidence are just because obviously a lot of historical evidence and reconstruction of the past is speculative.
Right.
So the question is, what's the epistemic level of that historical narration? Is it just something that is agreed upon through historians who take a naturalistic perspective based upon reconstructing the evidence, which are limited and not definitive? Then if the Quran comes and says something, or a revelation says something and tries to negate it, then we would say, okay, do we have justification for the revelation? If we do, are they equal or greater than the claims against, the historical claims that counteract it? If it's greater than this revelation, then obviously there's a problem with the revelation now.
Right.
Yeah. And there's no possibility of reconciliation. But if it's less than, then obviously we don't then have a justification to leave the higher epistemic value for the lower epistemic value.
Yeah. So, I mean, it seems to me that then, like within the Quranic epistemology or the Islamic epistemology, the Quran, in some sense, when it comes to also miracles, it takes the view that in these cases, whatever we experience in this world is not as upheld, right? Like, for example, like you gave of the fire of Allah changing the fire to cold, even though we don't have any experience in this world of such a thing occurring.
Yeah.
The text saying so, we have to believe that.
Yeah, that's right. Because the issue is that look, when we say the text says it, we believe it. Again, like it goes back to the authority of the text, why we justify that. But the issue, but when we have a claim that negates a particular experience,
right,
or a claim that seems to go against, and I'm going to use the word reason, we have to then classify what that reason is. So, like I said, we would look at claims about, let's say, the logical problem of the Trinity. Yeah, the Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God.
Right.
The Father is not the Son is not the Holy Spirit, and there is exactly one God. Yeah. Now, if you take and Jake, when he's here, and discusses, he goes into more detail. Brother called Muslim Metaphysician, his channel, he goes into more. But if you take the word "is" as an "is" of identity, so the Father is God, but then by classical law of identity, transitivity would say the Father is the Son.
Yeah.
So we would say, okay, well, that's a logical problem if you take it that. There are other routes that Christians, Trinitarians take, but that's a separate discussion in order to try to avoid that. But if you take it like that, then you are going to get a position of a logical problem. So I've just given that as an example. So if you've got a claimed revelation that contradicts something like this, then we would say, okay, that for us would be something that would put a negative mark on the revelation. If, however, the revelation talks about certain things which are inductively arrived at, like, for example, water boiling at 100 degrees Celsius at normal room conditions, and then there was an instance where the Quran or the revelation claims that it boiled at 60 degrees Celsius, then we wouldn't take that as a way to defeat. So, if you find many Muslims, when they're talking about other traditions, like whether that's Christianity or Judaism or other religions out there, they don't negate the fact that prophets did miracles and say, oh, look, how ridiculous is that? Like, you get a lot of atheists say, oh, look, such and such animal spoke or whatever. We don't really talk about that, because we say, yeah, that's possible. It's logically possible for that to occur. So therefore, that can't be a basis to negate the revelation if the revelation is true, or if there is justification for the revelation in other ways. So yeah, sorry, long-winded answer, but that's the point.
Okay, so I mean, this is kind of what I was hoping for today. I enjoy this, right? Because I'm learning about your perspective. So this next question is, so I'm taking it back a little bit, so I apologize to anyone listening, whatever. So we've established that there's God. How do you get from the establishment of God to acceptance of this particular idea of God within this particular text? What's that connection? Actually, let's do it this way. So the cosmological argument, Kalam's, it only gives us a cause, right? So how do you go from a cause, the first cause, or the cause, to a being, to the being of Islam, the God of Islam, to the Quran? I mean, how does that work?
So there's these types of cosmology. So first thing is that I think we have a family of arguments when it comes to the belief in a creator and justification for a creator. You have the various cosmological arguments that you have, and you have other arguments like transcendental arguments, moral arguments, etc. So you have a family of different arguments that are going to help you come to the conclusion that a creator exists. Now, if you're going to take specifically the types of cosmological arguments, so cosmological arguments for the audience are those arguments where you look out into the world and you try to rationally deduce certain conclusions about what you see around the world. Now, in the cosmological arguments, you're going to have two stages. The first stage is coming to a conclusion that something eternal exists. And then there's a second stage to say, well, what are the properties we should expect of this eternal force or eternal being that exists? So Kalam cosmological argument, as formed by William Lane Craig or previously Imam Ghazali, takes you to an eternal cause. That's right. So that would be like the first stage of the argument. The second stage of the argument would say, okay, what type of properties or what would we expect of this eternal cause? Would it be something that's a non-agent, i.e. something that doesn't have a will, didn't choose to create, or is it something that so is it like a mechanical force, or is it something that looks like that chose to create, and had knowledge of what it was creating? And so therefore we would use arguments like, for example, Imam Ghazali. I don't know if you come across Imam Ghazali's argument on this point, Mukunda, how he goes from saying eternal cause, but it's a personal being.
Just frozen and dropped. Just give us a second, Sharif. No, I think his broadband's acting up. You may have to repeat that piece again. While he's dropped, I think this is an excellent point, and this is actually the point we wanted to explore very early on in the program. For those joining late, this was actually a point where, if earlier in the discussion we diverted to a few of the topics, but this is fundamentally, I think, the key.
Sorry about that.
No, Mukunda. So, how much of the response did you catch from Brother Sharif?
Not much at all, man.
No, sorry.
No, okay.
No, that was my fault.
Okay,
I don't know what happened. My bad.
Okay, so go ahead, Sharif.
Yes, Mukunda was saying, you got the point about two stages of the argument. The first stage that gets us to eternal being.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then the second stage that says, okay, is it a personal agent?
Oh no, I did not. Sorry.
Oh, right, okay.
I think I just got cut off even before we got to how you went from cause to a being.
Right. Okay. So we basically saying, okay, so when we talk about the first stage of the argument, we're coming to a conclusion that there is something eternal. Now, what that eternal thing is, that's up for a second stage argument or second stage cosmological argument. And what is maybe the best explanation of, is it a mechanical force or is it something that has some sort of will or intentionality to create? Yeah.
Okay.
So Imam Ghazali, when he talks about, whatever begins to exist requires an explanation stroke cause, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has an explanation and cause, and that cause has to be eternal because through an infinite regress, you have to have at least one thing that's eternal according to him. I don't know if you come across why he then argued for a personal agent or an agent with will.
You mean in Aristotelian thought or just generally?
No, just specifically Imam Ghazali, his argument. What his argument. I don't know if you've come across that.
It's been a while since I've read it, so I don't remember. Yeah.
No problem. So his argument was basically to say that if you have an eternal cause where everything is necessary and sufficient to cause its effect, then the effect would be eternal. So his argument, because it rests upon something where the effect begins and is not eternal, then he's saying, therefore, it's not the case that you have a necessary being which has no will, but rather you have a necessary being that has a will, because a will becomes a sufficient reason. And that's how we see around us that agents are those things that choose to create where there are no prior necessitating causes for it to create.
Yeah, I don't see how that logically connects from a cause to a being, because it could be entirely just an eternal will that exists.
Even if you say eternal will, that's the point, isn't it? Is that the issue is that are we talking about an agent that willed something into existence?
Well, I mean, when we're talking about a will can just be a drive, right? It could just be a not, because the cosmological argument just says there has to be a cause. It doesn't ultimately say that cause itself can't have a cause and it can't be infinite regress. So the fact that we don't have an infinite regress is not a really issue of logic. It's just that we don't like it.
Well, I think it's a bit more than that. So you have something called causal finitism, which is being perceived as something which has negation of, it results in affirming and non-affirming at the same time. So you have something like causal finitism. You have other people who would argue that it's a metaphysical impossibility, meaning that, and that comes down to a discussion of what does logical possibility mean in this context, and what's the difference between that and a metaphysical possibility, which is a big topic, but we can discuss that. Sure. So the issue is that from Imam Ghazali's point of view, and when we're talking about cosmological, I'm talking about here specifically the Kalam cosmological argument. And like I said, prior to that, we have a whole family of arguments that we use to justify. It doesn't necessitate us to use just one argument. And I think as human beings, we don't really use one argument.
No, we use multitude, right?
Exactly. When I'm looking at you, or when I look at Muhammad, and I think, is he a real human being or is he chat GPT or whatever it is?
Mm-hmm.
I've got multiple ways of sort of distinguishing that, and I build that picture in my head and I come to a conclusion. So in the same way with regards to belief in a creator. But in terms of Imam Ghazali's Kalam cosmological argument, what he's saying is that if you have an eternal cause and there is no choice for the eternal cause, it necessitates its creating power, then the effect would be eternal. Do you see that point?
Well, okay. So if there's a cause, that's an eternal cause.
Correct. Which has all the necessary and sufficient principles to create the effect.
Right. So it would just be eternal effect, but why it couldn't just be eternal cause and effect? It could be a cycle of cause and effect, cause and effect.
Yeah, so cycle itself would still fall into an infinite regress.
Which is what's wrong with that?
No, but Mukunda, this goes back to the point, which is that you're saying that, okay, if we grant the KCA, and by granting the KCA means you're granting the fact that things that begin to exist, the universe, meaning that an actual infinite is impossible or causal finitism is necessary, then if you're granting all of that point, the conclusion would be, obviously, like you said.
So this is the new cosmological argument, right? By the one, what's his name uses? William Lane Craig.
Yeah, William Lane Craig. Yeah. He's, and he admits that he took it from Imam Ghazali as well.
Yeah.
So the point being is that if we're granting all of these points, then what we also grant, what becomes an entailment of that position would be that, okay, if the eternal cause had everything necessary and sufficient to cause the effect, like you said, it would have an eternal effect. Yeah?
Right,
but if we granted the argument, we're saying the effect is not eternal. It had a beginning. There was a moment where there was a cause and no effect, and then there was a moment where there was cause and effect.
No, so what I'm saying to that is, it doesn't necessarily logically lead to that. It can lead to an eternal set of causes grounded by an eternal being.
But now you're no longer granting the argument.
No, I know. I'm not granting the modern cosmological argument. I think the historic cosmological argument didn't have the sense of the extra element of there is no actual infinite.
Well, Mukunda, the thing is that obviously cosmological arguments are itself a division of different types of argument. Contingency argument falls into it. There are different forms of contingency argument. Kalam cosmological argument is a form of cosmological argument. Yeah. So if we and this is the point, I think what we're saying is we're not just talking about different types of argument. We're talking about a specific argument, which was the Kalam cosmological argument, which itself, with Imam Ghazali, he talks about different types of infinities and whether infinities can exist in the real world, and he argues that it doesn't exist. So that's the point. Point is that if we've acknowledged and accepted that, even if it's taken for granted, the entailments of that position is that you have a cause without effect at a moment, and then you have a cause with effect. Yeah.
Right.
And so that issue of there being a beginning of the effect implies that this cause was not necessary and sufficient to always have created the effect. So it's not some mechanical force that's just simply driven. Like if you had an eternal flame, you'd have eternal light from that flame. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, given the parameters of that cosmological argument, I have to, again, this is where I was talking earlier about the nature of our conversations about the nature of induction, deduction, right? Like Indian logic is not deductive, we're inductive, where we allow for the fact that a statement also has to have some validity in the world of whatever world we inhabit. Like for example, if you were to say all crows are black, and this is I see a crow, then therefore it's black. That would be a logically valid argument, deductively, but it wouldn't be necessarily inductively the same.
Yeah, that's fine. But I think from our perspective, when we talk about cosmological arguments, so obviously you got like the non-cosmological arguments,
right?
Like the ontological argument, moral argument, transcendental arguments. Yeah. So those types of arguments, they don't require you to go out into the world and look. So a cosmological argument is those arguments where you go out into the world and look,
right?
And then from that, you're going to come to certain conclusions. Now, some of those premises, like for example, whatever begins to exist as a cause, some of those premises themselves would be in part justified through induction. So we experience things that begin to exist, and those things that begin to exist that we've experienced also have causes.
Right.
We would also make a further claim, as going into this particular argument, like other scholars talk about this,
sure,
because they talk about there are certain rational necessities that we have to have in our mind, like the principle of causality,
right,
in order to make sense of the world. The fact that we are able to make sense of the world means that causality must exist. Therefore, causality is an a priori position before we come to our understanding of the world.
Yeah, we have to accept that there's such a cause. There can be cause and effect, and that it's a law, right? Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. But at the same time, we're postulating within that there's someone that's beyond that, correct? that somehow doesn't fall prey to cause and effect, but somehow is still a cause.
That's right.
Without it necessarily being an effect of something else.
But that's because the way to explain that would be this idea of will, the ability to choose to do an act,
right,
which comes internal from the agent and is non-necessitating, meaning that this internal agent didn't have to do that.
Well, yes, but then it also shows that there is a want, maybe, because why would God will if he doesn't have a desire?
So this is where we have our epistemic limits as Muslims. We would say, okay, we can make certain claims about the creator. Like, for example, very basic example, if somebody's knocking on my door,
right,
I'm saying, okay, somebody's behind the door, but is it a man or a woman? Is he this high, 6 foot tall, 5 foot tall? I don't know. Yeah. Is he from India? Is he from England? Sure. I'm not sure. So there's epistemic limits. All we want to do as Muslims, primarily is keep our metaphysical commitments based upon our rationality to a minimum. Yeah. So we want to come to certain conclusions, or we believe we can come to certain conclusions without this overload of trying to adopt lots of metaphysics about how the world is, how reality is, how wants are, how choices are, how knowledge is, all of these things. We want to keep it to a minimum. We come using that process to the fact that there's a creator with a will. Now, beyond that, how that will manifests, why did God create? What does it mean for God to create in terms of desire, want, etc.? That's beyond our capacity to understand. Yeah, we either need direct revelation, or if revelation doesn't contain it, it doesn't mean that we're not warranted to believe these things. Yeah, so we don't have to have the full explanation of a thing in order to know the thing exists. So it's like I give the example of you guys don't call it paracetamol. I think you call it amino penicillin. It's a simple analgesic, simple painkiller. What's it called? What's paracetamol?
It's called was it
Tylenol?
Tylenol or something? Tylenol.
That's your brand. That's what they call it, the brand.
Yeah.
Now, from the science point of view, we don't know what's the mechanism of cause of action. Yeah, of why it causes the pain relief that it causes. Why does it cause the reduction of temperature? But the fact that we don't know the cause, the mechanism of action, doesn't mean that we aren't warranted and justified to believe that if I've got a headache, I take this Tylenol or paracetamol in order to lower my temperature and reduce pain. Yeah. So
right.
In the same way that,
but that's also in the real world where things can play out, right? At some level, it's just a lack of knowledge which you can gather over time. So in these cases of talking about the logic of God and so on, there's no more information that one can gain outside of what's already present to add to that conversation. So at some level, we're just making assumptions, correct?
Well, that's the point. The point here is that
right.
I'm not making an assumption about how paracetamol works until I've got information. If I don't have that information, I can't make that assumption. But I'm still warranted and justified to believe that it works. Yeah.
Right.
So in the same way, in terms of God, is that okay? We believe that this necessary eternal being exists, and we believe that it has a will, has the ability to choose. Now, what causes that choice? Why did God choose to do this over that? If you want to use the word desire or anything like that, we don't know. So we don't go into that discussion. Yeah. We just say, okay, we're warranted to have that. If we had the information, we would be able to know it. What type of information would be able to gain in order to justify the reasons why God created? Well, that would require something that God himself reveals to us. If he hasn't revealed it to us, then we wouldn't know.
Yeah, I mean, but there are built-in premises to all this stuff anyway, there too, right? Like ultimately the idea that if there's a will doesn't act on its own. There's, these are all definitional things, right? For anyone to have a will, there has to be a want. To will something, you have to want something or desire. So therefore we have to say that God has a desire.
I don't think so. I don't think you can. I think even if I was to look at a person, or let's say, for example, SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence.
Yeah.
The way the scientists are looking for intelligence out there, they're looking for a signal that doesn't have a naturalistic explanation. Yeah. So that just is a basic, general understanding of how SETI works. Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. They don't need to know what the want was. They just need to identify that there is a signal with a repeating pattern that seems to have some sort of potential code that is not explained by some sort of naturalistic phenomena like a quasar, a pulsar, or a supernova, or black hole, etc. If they can demonstrate that, then they can say, okay, this, if we can eliminate all possible natural explanations for the creation of this, we then say it's intelligent. Yeah. So therefore, we're warranted to justify the intelligence, even without knowing what the meaning, the semantic of that signal was, or the intent.
Well, that's a placeholder. That's what we use as a placeholder, right? Because we can't cover the gamut of all different things in the world. We use that as we've reduced all what we know so far to be an explanation. Therefore, it must be not these things. It must be this, right? It's just a placeholder until we actually have actual knowledge of something. So this is
no, I think it's more than that. I think, for example, when I look at yourself, Mukundar, or Mansoor, I'm looking, and when he speaks to me, I'm thinking, okay, this person is an agent. He's a free willing agent. Yeah. I'm not thinking to myself that this person is a robot. And the reason why is because I'm saying, okay, there's a distinction between robots and human beings.
Well, it's also because we're taking the perspective that the other person opposite us is much like us, right? That has an internal will and desires, right? If there was a functionally robot that looked like us in front of us, you'd assume the same, even though you'd be wrong.
Yeah, but if I had a person, what I'm doing when I'm assessing Mansoor is, or let's say, for example, I come across a rock and it's rolling downhill. I'm not going to say, oh, it has agency. Yeah, but if I see a rock and it's rolling uphill, I'm going to say, oh, something very spooky is going on. Something's causing the rock to make the choice to go against gravity. Yeah, and therefore I'm going to have this idea that therefore there must be something intelligent. And the same thing with regards to SETI, search for extraterrestrial intelligence, is that they're not just putting as a placeholder saying, oh, because if they wanted to put a placeholder, they'll just say it's unknown. There's an unknown signal. But what they're doing is they're saying, okay, no, there's an intelligence behind this signal. And the intelligence doesn't necessitate us to say, okay, he looks like us. He must be a human being. It's just saying it's an intelligence. We're saying also, we don't need to know what the desire was for this intelligence because it's non-naturalist explanation, etc. Yeah. So I'm just saying is that we have experiences of our own decisions that we make, and it's true we have desires, but I wouldn't say that's the necessitating definition of our ability to assess whether something has an intelligence or not, or has a will or not.
Well, that's the thing. It's like if we know all our experiences of will and of anything like that are connected to other beings, right? So if we know someone's willing something, we're using the word will, we're clearly meaning it has some sort of intent.
Yeah, that's right. So there's an intent behind it.
So a teleological purpose, meaning there's something that is yet to be achieved.
No, I don't think it's necessarily something that yet to be achieved. I think
unless it's mechanical, which is fine. Then if it's just a mechanical thing, then it's if it's a being, if it's a thinking, intelligent being, and it's doing something in order to achieve something.
Yeah, but the assumption here is that you're saying that to achieve something is because it's lacking something in itself.
Or has a desire, yeah. It's not self-fulfilled.
So it's lacking something. So I'm saying no, you don't. I'm saying you don't have to make that. That is, I think, an unwarranted position to hold about will, because I'm saying that in order, like I said at the beginning, as Muslims, what we try to do is we try to keep our metaphysical commitments to the minimum. So when we talk about will, we're not talking about, okay, let's understand what will is in relation to lots of different metaphysics behind it.
No, I'm just taking logically speaking, right? Like will is something that has to accomplish. Like to do something, you're trying to do something.
No, because I'm defining will as that which doesn't require any prior causes and is non-necessitating.
Well, I mean,
which is, I think, is the minimal definition that everybody can agree upon. Those ideas, for example, of having desires, requiring completion,
those things are all for beings that already have intelligence.
No, because I can make an argument against that. Yeah. So there are arguments on free will, which is that it's indeterministic. Yeah. That there are no necessitating reasons behind why I would choose strawberry cake over chocolate cake. There may be reasons, but they're non-necessitating reasons.
Well, I mean, you desire strawberry cake. You want to eat it, so you eat strawberry cake.
Yeah, but then if you look at the logic of that argument, you'd basically denying free will. You'd be saying that actually there are no ability to make choices because all choices are drives, and all drives are either biological or caused by external realities, which causes you to make the choices. Whereas actually we hold the idea that there are no, that free will can be understood as non-necessitating influences where the person can make an indeterministic act. And I think that's the point that we're saying, is that what you're identifying when it comes to somebody who has a willing agent is that he has an indeterministic ability to act, meaning he's acting not by necessity, but acting and not acting because something else is causing you, but acting based upon its own decision.
Its own decision to do what? I mean, I guess that's the point you're saying you can't get to, right? You're just leaving that be.
Yeah, we're leaving that be, but I'm saying it's still justified to say that free will is that which is indeterministic.
So,
that
whatever that decision is, it's probably entirely arbitrary.
It could be, but I'm saying is that the point here is this: is that if we identify a indeterministic act of a being, so when I use the word being here, I'm just talking about that which exists in its philosophical sense. So if we identify an indeterministic act of a being, then I'm saying that warrants justification of will. And I'm saying that is how various philosophers have argued for. I'm not talking about Muslim philosophers, I'm talking general philosophers argued for the idea of free will. So the idea that it's connected to desires, wants, and reasons, therefore, is not necessary, and therefore it can't be said that it's logically necessitating that a will implies desire, which therefore implies that the being requires something that it doesn't already have.
Okay. I mean, I think this is interesting. I mean, we can pursue that some more.
Yeah. So therefore that's what Imam Ghazali, if he's using the KCA, the Kalam cosmological argument, he's saying that, well, you've got a cause which is eternal and that is necessitated to create, which would make the effect eternal. But if we've agreed that the effect is not eternal, then the cause that's eternal is non-necessitating. And the only thing that we know that's non-necessitating but has the ability to create an effect is the will. And that's why he comes to the conclusion that a creator has a will. Now, other scholars use different arguments. So some scholars will use the idea of takhsis, which means specification, that the universe is specified in certain laws. Yeah. And specification is a way of us identifying that something has made a choice. So if I had a red triangle drawn outside my house and I didn't know who drew it, and it's red, I'd be saying, okay, who drew it? Yeah, I'd be thinking of an intelligent willed agent, even if I didn't know the desire. And the reason why is because it could have been blue, could have been yellow, could have been pink, could have been green, but it's red. So it's specified in a particular way. So when we look at the universe, we're seeing that there are things which are specified, takhsis, and this is an argument that Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, he would use in order to demonstrate will. There are other arguments about, like, for example, design within the universe, more theological type arguments that are also used as second stage arguments for cosmological arguments. Or a modern argument would be like consciousness. Consciousness is not reducible to the material. Right. So if if a non-conscious agent can't produce consciousness, and we're saying that there is a fundamental cause to the whole of the universe, and we have consciousness in the universe, then that thing that caused it must also be conscious. So there's 3 or 4 or 5 different arguments that people use in order to come to that conclusion. Sure.
So I think those are all fair. And those are arguments used by both Muslims and Christians, and even the Nyaya school of Indian thought about proving the nature of God and God's existence.
Yeah, I've come across Hare Krishnas that use similar arguments.
Yeah. So going from there, how does one get to the Islamic Quranic God from that?
So from Muslim perspective,
hold on.
So just before we go, quick time check. Sharif, are you still okay for a few more minutes?
A few more minutes.
Okay, so you let us know when you need to go because I think Mukunda.
If you don't remind him, he'll be okay. Even longer.
If you want to do another session on this kind of stuff.
This is a good question because this actually goes to the crux of what we opened with,
right?
Which is how do we get from knowing this being to knowing the Islamic conception of God? And I think if we can get to the Islamic conception of God, then I think we'll have got to a natural segue where we can have a follow-on session and we can continue this line of questioning.
That's fine. So
yeah.
I think
Mukunda would probably ask a further question actually, which is a prior question to how we get to Islam. Is that how do we get from deism to theism?
Right. That was my
yeah. Actually, yeah, that is the prior question. Okay, go ahead, Sharif. All yours.
So, just to plug Thought Adventure podcast, we actually did a section, a live stream on this. How do you get from why would we accept theism as opposed to deism? There's different arguments, and lots of these are big topics anyway, because I think we've spent about 2 hours talking about this. But we would say, okay, human beings are created with this natural, innate instinct to worship, or this spiritual instinct. And as I mentioned earlier, spirituality is not something just because it's satisfied means that it's actually satisfied correctly. Now, if we accept Kalam cosmological argument, and we accept the entailments that it requires a will, then what we're accepting is that whether it's through evolutionary process or not, that's irrespective at this moment in time, this being chose to create knowing that the being that it was going to create would have this attribute of wanting to worship. So ultimately, this attribute of wanting to worship or sanctify is something that was created by this being. This would be the argument from deism to theism. So therefore, if it's the case, then and the satisfaction of the spiritual instinct is not known by the human being. So let's say, for example, what is a sanctification instinct? We would say it's the desire for human beings to connect to the divine. So something which is more than material.
Right.
To have that relationship with it, to, and that has various manifestations like submission, following, worship, etc. But it's that connection, that relationship. If that divine is this necessary eternal being that created us, and ultimately we are a manifestation of that creation, which includes the fact that we have this desire to want to connect with this being, which is caused by this being. This desire to want to connect to this being is caused by this being as well. Then how to satisfy that spiritual instinct? Is it something that we can know, or is it something that requires some sort of revelation?
So a couple of things here real quick.
Yeah.
From the last position of there's a being that has a will. A being with the will does not necessarily have to have knowledge. It could just be will itself, right? It could just create and just will to create as and will it when it chooses, with no sense of what it's creating, how it's creating. It just desires to create.
We would say
no, but there's no reason for there to have anything more than a will.
So it goes back to that point about what Ibn Taymiyyah said about takhsis, which is specification. So the universe has certain laws that could have been another way. Water boils at 100 degrees Celsius at room conditions. It could have boiled at higher or lower.
Sure, maybe there's other universes it does.
Yeah, so there's specification, and even if there are other universes, it's still specification in each universe. So each universe, there's an ordering. Yeah. So this universe doesn't operate according to another.
Maybe there's universes that are inert. Right. This is what I'm saying is like.
So this, but the point here is that you have specification in each universe, and each universe is ordered in.
Or it just happens naturally. The Lord, I mean, the will wills existence, and the existence wills itself or flows out however it's going to flow out. So there might be infinite universes, of which some universes are functional, other universes aren't, and each of them are just, it's like an experiment occurring across the entire reality. All the one did was will it.
Yeah. So there's a few things. So again, if we're granting the KCA, we're basically saying there's still a finite number of universes because of the problem of an actual infinite. So there would still be a finite number of universes. If there's a finite number of universes, then there's a finite number of universes with various specifications. And therefore, it's not the case that there's an infinite number of universes, an infinite number of specificational attributes that could exist. So we're therefore still left with specification that each universe is specified. So if there's 100, 10, 1,000, a billion, there's still a certain number.
I don't think that jump makes sense from finite number of universes. There can be finite number of universes. There can be infinite number of universes, all with beginnings. That's all it means.
No, because the argument that's used by Imam Ghazali and the KCA argues against an actual infinite.
Right. I'm saying so even the being that you're talking about cannot be infinite then.
No, because the idea of an actual infinite is discrete parts that make up an infinity. So we're not saying God is a discrete part. So
yeah. So I'm not even saying that. I'm just saying God is a cause, and causes infinite universes because he causes it. He can. It's his ability to cause infinity can occur, right?
Right.
Because he's not a part. So there can be functionally infinite universes.
Yeah. But again, sorry, Mukhanda, it does go back to the discussion about if we granted the premises of the KCA.
Even if I grant that premise is what I'm saying, because you're saying there is a God, right? There's a cause. There's a cause, and we've got to that cause being a being.
Yeah.
So that being itself is either actual infinite or not. And you're saying because it's not it doesn't have parts, it is an actual infinite. So that
it's not an actual infinite, yeah.
It is an actual infinite, right?
It's not.
God is not.
Yeah. So an actual infinite is an infinite that's composed of parts, discrete parts.
Okay.
So we're saying God is not composed of discrete parts.
So God is,
according to that argument.
Is he infinite then?
Eternal. So we use the term eternal, independent, self-sufficient. Yeah.
Okay.
So if you want to use the word infinite, you can use infinite in a qualitative sense.
Sure.
But you wouldn't be able to use an infinite in a quantitative sense.
Yeah, there's not infinite gods.
There is an infinite parts.
Yes.
That's what it's saying as well. So you can't have an infinite parts of something. Now, some people, and it's valid, and even within the Islamic tradition, people critique the idea of an actual infinite, even though they hold on to causal finitism. Yeah,
sure.
But as we were saying, for the sake of the argument, for the KCA, for the sake of the argument, for the KCA, in essence, denies an actual infinite. Yeah,
well,
you can't
denies an actual infinite within a bounded world. Right.
No, it's more than that. So, for example, Imam Ghazali's arguments against an actual infinite. I don't know if you. I know it's a while ago, but have you come across the orbits argument?
I don't recall it. No.
Yeah. So basically, he was saying that the orbit of the Earth takes 365 days, and the orbit of Saturn takes, I don't know, I think it's 10 years around the Sun. And so he says, if the universe has always existed and the solar system has always existed, because obviously that's how they viewed it, then the number of orbits of Saturn would be equal to the number of orbits of Earth, because both of them would have to be
actually infinite. Yeah, I understand that argument. But again, I mean, this is what I'm saying is within a bounded frame, right? This universe is, even if it has a beginning and it's unbounded, right? In that sense, you're saying it's all equal. What I'm saying is from God's perspective, right? We're saying there's this being that is not an actual infinite, but is internal, of infinite power, quality, whatever. His will is infinite, correct?
So so when we say his will is infinite, I think what it is
he can create himself infinite universes. There's nothing to stop him from doing that, unless the logic, he's bound by logic.
Yeah, we don't say he's bound by logic. What we're saying is that when we say something is logically impossible, what we're saying is that the semantics of the sentence is meaningless. So even though I might be able to understand the words, I'm saying the actual meaning, the semantic, is a non-thing. So when we say God is all-powerful, as an example, omnipotent, and then people say, oh, well, can't God create a stone that's so heavy that he can't lift?
Yeah.
And then you say no, and then you say, oh, are you bounding God by limitations? Say no, it's because when we say omnipotence, we're saying ability to do all things which are logically possible.
Right. So logically possible, meaning within the world of language.
Yeah. So our language, when we talk about an infinite number of universes, an actual infinite that's created, so what we're saying is, does it make semantic sense, to say an infinite number of finite things? And we're saying in this argument, if you accept this argument, we're saying that that's impossible. That it's impossible. It's that word, that term, that language is meaningless.
Right. Yeah? So again, this is where I'm being very clear. If I grant the argument, it doesn't mean the argument is true. The argument's valid. It doesn't necessarily give you anything about the truth of the argument.
Yeah, but that's a separate point, isn't it? Because
right,
I think
it is a separate point, but it's a point that's important.
Yeah, but when I turn around and if I was to say, for example, to yourself, Mukunda, if I accept the argument, or I grant the argument for the sake of argument, what I'm doing for you is I'm saying, well, if I assume your premises are true and that it logically follows,
right,
then I'm going to accept.
You're just saying it's a valid
argument. Accept the argument. Yeah, but it's more than just what I'm doing is I'm not just saying that your structure is valid. What I'm saying is that I'm also agreeing that your premises are true as well. I'm not saying it is true. I'm just saying for the sake of argument.
Right, exactly. Yeah,
so I'm saying for this. Yeah. So if we're following this for the sake of argument, then we have to accept that what Imam Ghazali and others would say is that an actual infinite, an infinite amount of finite things is a meaningless sentence. It's a meaningless proposition. It doesn't carry meaning. It's not got any. So it's not a thing. So when we say God cannot create this, we're not saying that God is bound by logic. It means that the thing that we're talking about is like a married bachelor. Can God
right. It's a logical impossibility because it definitionally doesn't exist. Right?
Yes. So that's what they'd be arguing. Yes. Now, that's if we grant that. Now, I know there are, like I said, within the Islamic tradition, different positions on this particular actual infinite, even though they generally accept causal finitism. Yeah. So that series of causes have to have a beginning, but like you mentioned, there could be an infinite number of causes, but the efficient cause ultimately is God. So that's one argument that some people use. But for the sake of this argument, which is the KCA, they would deny that. Now, if they're denying that, then on this premise of saying, okay, can you have an infinite number of universes with an infinite number of attributes? We would say, no, not on the basis of this argument, you can't do that. So then you have a finite number of universes, and under the finite number of universes, each universe still could have had an infinite number of attributes, but was chosen to have a specific set of attributes as opposed to another set of attributes. Yeah. Now that specification implies that the being that's made the choice had the knowledge of the different possibilities. Now that's also connected to the idea of omnipotence as well.
But I don't see that jump, right? So that's what I'm saying is the knowledge doesn't necessarily follow from a will.
This is to do with specification.
Right, but that's an element that you're throwing in later on.
No. So specification was one of the justifications for will. Yeah. And so specification says, okay, if I had, so let's say, for example, why do we say God is all powerful or God has omniproperties? We would say that one of the reasons why would be, and it's moving into a different argument, which like a contingency argument.
It's a different argument. Yeah,
which would be the fact that there are no arbitrary limits. Yeah. So if you're saying there's arbitrary limits, then there needs to be a reason and explanation as to why it has arbitrary limits. So in this situation, we're saying, okay, there can't be arbitrary limits for a necessary being because then it wouldn't be necessary, it would be contingent. So therefore, it would require an explanation for its existence. Yeah. So we're saying, okay, there's a necessary being. So therefore, when we say that something is omnipotent, the creator is omnipotent, we're saying it has to have either arbitrary limits or non-arbitrary limits. In this context, it would be non-arbitrary limits, meaning omniproperties. Yeah.
Okay.
So in that situation, when you've got an omnipotent being that has the ability to create all things and has the ability to choose what to create, then it follows that it would have knowledge of what are.
But I'm also trying to figure out where we get omnipotent from. So we went from from a base being to a deistic God with will. And where's omnipotence come from there? Because by the very nature of the world existing, he must be able to create. Therefore, he has power to do so.
No, it's not just that. It's because it's to do with the fact that if you're going to have arbitrary limits upon a being, anything that exists, then it's natural to ask the question, why does it have that amount as opposed to another amount?
Well, I mean, are we putting a limit when you say it has the ability to create?
So let me give you a practical example of this. So, for example, if I saw a snowman outside my house and I'm like thinking to myself, why is there a snowman outside my house? Now, I don't need to have seen the snowman to have begun to exist in order to know that it has a cause. Now, you might say, well, it's through past experience. But I think there's also another aspect to this, which is that I know that the snowman has certain arbitrary limits, it could have been other than what it is. Yeah. So the fact that it has a certain amount of thing within it, yeah, whether it's its attributes, its limitations, or the amount of snow, it could have been bigger or smaller.
Sure.
Then from that, I infer that obviously it's contingent, it's dependent upon something to have determined what it is. Yeah. So it's this idea of determination, or in Arabic we use the word murajjih, which means the determinant. Yeah. So there is a determining factor on things which are arbitrarily limited. So if we're saying there's something which is outside of this contingent, limited, dependent thing, then it must be non-arbitrarily limited. Yeah. So it can't just have arbitrary limits. So its power can't be 99. Yeah. Where it could have been 7 or it could have been 110, but rather it would have to be non-arbitrary, which basically would mean unlimited.
Does that mean that, or it just means undetermined until
no,
it determines it?
Because
it's potentially unlimited, but it can be limited
so
because we don't know.
Yeah, so if it's limited though, then we would say that okay, it could.
If it chose a limit, but that's the thing, right? It willed its own limit, and that then it's bound by that. I mean, this what I'm saying is even this conversation about these absolute terms, some way at some form ends up becoming very similar to the married bachelor kind of idea.
No, well, I'm not sure in terms of the how you're linking it to the married bachelor in this context.
Well, what I'm saying is so we want to say it's unlimited, but within that limitation, unlimitedness, it can limit itself, right? This is again where it goes back to the stone. That can you make a stone that's so heavy that God can't?
So that
right? So this is where I'm saying is that by definitional points, conceptually, we hit brick walls.
So basically saying that. So this is the point by arbitrary limits. So we're saying that when we say that God cannot cause himself to die, we're not saying that's a limit on God. Yeah, we're saying that definitionally is meaningless sentence.
Exactly. So what I'm saying is a lot of what we do at this level is exactly that, right? We're trying to justify things that are beyond the scope of our understanding and fitting it into our understanding.
No, because see, I think again we would be warranted to say, okay, if we're talking about something, whether that's a being that exists within our realm or outside of our realm, then we would say yes, the semantics that we use to describe that being has to be meaningful. It can't be non-meaningful. So if I'm talking about outside of this universe there's a married bachelor, I'm saying, well, that's a meaningless statement. It doesn't make any sense. Yeah, I might as well just string words together in a random order and then say, well, is that a case? Can God create that? Well, it's a meaningless sentence. So if we accept that God is eternal and necessary, then by definition it cannot become contingent and have a beginning. Yeah.
So I mean, are we kind of saying that God doesn't have arbitrary will?
What do you mean God doesn't have arbitrary will?
He can't just do what he wants.
No, he can, but what he's going to do is going to do those things which are logically and metaphysically possible for God.
But I mean, I guess that's like limiting on him, correct?
No, it's not limiting, because if we go back to the issue of logical possibility, what we're just simply saying is that as human beings, from our language, we use terms, and when we're saying can God do a thing, we're saying the thing itself must have semantic meaning, must have meaning. It must be a thing. So when we say something is all powerful, capable to do all things, what we're saying is that the thing itself must be a thing. When we're talking about a married bachelor or four-sided triangle, we're saying that is not a thing. So it's outside of what God. It's outside of this idea of omnipotence.
So is God a thing too then, within this context, or no?
So when we talk in an analogical predicative sense, yeah.
Okay.
So we're not saying it's identical to what we experience around us. But when we talk about existence, if we say God exists, is a being, like when we talk in philosophy, things that exist, we call them beings. So yes, God exists, but he's different in the context of obviously he's not a contingent being, he's a necessary being. And when we talk about necessity, then we're now bound by a particular definition of when we talk about this issue of necessity. Yeah. So, moving forward, so when we're talking about the ability for human beings this desire for human beings to want to worship, yeah, I think it's warranted. Now you can say, okay, I don't think so. There are other speculative arguments, for this, but I think it's warranted to say, okay, if I have this desire to want to worship, and there's other things as well about in terms of our desires as well. We desire to be moral agents, yeah. We desire to have meaning and purpose, yeah. All of these desires that drives us, we would say, are caused and created by this necessary being, this creator, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, God, yeah.
Okay.
So therefore, the question then becomes, well, can I know what it means to be moral? Can I know what my meaning or a real meaning is? Not, we don't just, obviously you have nihilists who say we make our meanings up, but as human beings, I think we actually want real meaning, true meaning, yeah, in a real sense, yeah, not just something we make up in our heads, yeah. So we want real meaning, we want real purpose, and we want a real relationship with the creator. All of these things are components created within human beings. Therefore, if I can't know these things prior to revelation, I would be looking for and expecting some sort of revelation. God has created within me this desire to seek him out.
Okay.
So that's how we would move from deism to theism. Whole long discussion, many different arguments and evidences for this that various Muslims use. But that's how we would move to that. Then when we're moving towards why Islam, then again, that's a whole topic in itself. I think we've done streams here and on other places as well, like Thought Adventure Podcast, where we've talked about how do we assess why Islam is a candidate to look at as a revealed religion, as opposed to having to assess every religion. And we would say, okay, if we're expecting a revelation from a creator, then, it should be something that comes from a necessary being. It cannot be a contingent being. It has to be something which is a guidance that tells us what's good and bad, tells us how to worship. It has to have it has to be preserved, so, we're actually getting what God said or the revelation claims to be, as opposed to something which has been interpolated or added to by human beings or corrupted over time. So it has to be preserved. And it has to be internally consistent, as well as have some external proofs and evidence to justify it as being from the creator. So when we look at Islam, we would say, okay, does it come from a creator? Does it claim to come from a creator? This necessary eternal being? Yes, it does. Surah Al-Ikhlas, 112th chapter of the Quran, is very clear in terms of what we understand as creators, as the Quran informs us. Then when we look at the issue of is it a preserved religion? Then we say, yeah, it's preserved because we've got evidences for its preservation from, the history of Islam in Mecca and Medina, to the preservation of the manuscripts, to the preservation of the oral recitation of the Quran. We have that. Then, do we have, is it internally, are there any internal consistencies or inconsistencies within it? We say there isn't. And are there external proofs? And we say, yeah, there are external proofs. One of those proofs are things like the linguistic miracles of the Quran, or the prophecies that the Prophet, peace be upon him, made, or the fact that the knowledge that the Quran contains wasn't understood or known for the people of the Arabian Peninsula at that time. Like, for example, the detailed knowledge of New Testament or the Gospels, or the Old Testament, or even science and technology, like, for example, the knowledge of the Greek or Roman or Jewish physicians that it also contains, as well as the omissions of where they made mistakes when they also had their particular theories about certain things as well. So there's lots of different arguments that we use. Other arguments about, could the Prophet, peace be upon him, be a liar? Could he have been deceived? Could he have been, was he truthful? These are arguments also we look at. So, for example, the Prophet, peace be upon him, was offered wealth and women and fortune and leadership in Mecca, so long as he compromised his message, and he refused to do this. And this was a time when he was being boycotted and his companions were being tortured. So there's various lines of arguments that when you take them together, you have a case for why we believe that Quran and the Prophet, peace be upon him, is a prophet of God.
Okay. I mean, I think to get into that next level of explanation will be a little longer. Maybe not today. Maybe I can have you on my podcast to talk about that, because I think it is interesting. Because today we really just did the top level of the past hour, honestly, when you came on, Sharif, where you got into the nuts and bolts of why Muslims believe. Well, I mean, how we're able to justify belief in some sense, right?
It's a very big topic, and there's lots of different layers within it.
Sure.
It's not, with Muslims, with any Muslim, what it tends to be is, like I said, if I'm looking at, if I'm looking at, for example, diagnosing a disease, I'm not just looking at one particular, okay, that's the symptom, means this.
Right.
You look at a range of evidences and arguments. And in the same way, with regards to Islam, you're looking at a range of evidence and arguments for belief in a creator. So we talked about KCA, we talked a bit about the contingency argument, but you also have transcendental arguments, like, for example, propositions. Are propositions do they contain mental content? And are there necessary propositions? And if they're necessary propositions and they contain mental content, then it means that there must be grounding for these necessary propositions. And that's one argument people use for the argument of the creator. I think James Anderson, who's a Christian, but he's written a paper on this, and Dr. Safruk Chowdhury as well, who's a Muslim, has also written a paper on this as well.
Mm-hmm.
So there's various arguments for belief in a creator, in the same way there's various arguments as to why we justify the rationality of the belief in a creator. Some of those arguments are going to be like pushes us towards Islam, and some of them are going to be negative in terms of the fact that why we reject other religions as well.
Sure. And I think that makes sense. From that perspective, right? Like within our traditions, we have different schools, right? We have one school like the Nyaya school, which will engage in these exact kind of conversations about nature of God and so on. And then you have the Mimamsa school, which talk about the nature of Vedanta, right? These schools are, many of them predate Islam by a couple hundred years, if not 1,000 years. But there's an entire corpus of texts on those. And I wish I was an expert at it, but I'm not. And there's quite a bit to cover there. So maybe next time I can bring someone on that is an expert, and we can discuss. I'll add whatever I can. But from my tradition internally, we have dealt with the Nyaya arguments, and our position, as I said earlier, was fundamentally like logic can't lead you to know God or justify God. It's a tool you can try. It's helpful at some level, but it really comes down to having the experience of divinity.
Okay, cool. I think maybe if we were to sort of, close the gap a little bit, I would say in terms of epistemic perspective, we would say, logical rationality cannot get us to know God. We need revelation. Yeah.
Right.
But what it can do is it can get us to the position that somebody's knocking on the door. But
Correct.
what does that being want from us? How does that being guide us? How does that being, tell us how to worship and how to treat others when peace is necessary and when warfare is sometimes necessary? How to interact with our children, how to interact with our wives. Is interest banking system allowed or not? These things are important things that we believe that require revelation in order to tell us how to live our lives, both as individuals and as society. Yeah. So in terms of knowing God in that sense, rationality and logic is not going to get us to know God in that sense, but that's why we need revelation. And even then, revelation itself will only tell us certain things, and there are certain things that are outside of our purview that even we've not been informed by revelation. But those things that we've not been informed by revelation, they're not those things which are going to cause us, things to doubt the revelation in and of itself. Yeah. I don't know if Mohammed wants to end it here. It's a nice little segue.
Yeah. No,